Okay, that should go ahead and start. And we'll start this review and remember. Let's see. All right, our first question is, what is classical music? And Annika, if you want to type in as fast as you can, and Sam, if you want to jump in, and anyone else who comes on to jump in and help review this stuff, you're so welcome to do that. But classical music, we're not talking about the classical era. The classical era is one era of music in the whole scheme of classical music. And so we're looking at the big definition of classical music, not just what's in that one little era. And it is art music of the Western world. One key notation of classical music is that it's written down. Its pitch, its meter, its speed, all the parts of a piece of music are written on a piece of paper. That idea is a new idea after thousands of years of people hearing music and then playing what they thought they heard, and it evolves and it adds and it takes away and then it disappears entirely and something new comes up with, and it's not the same. Music sometimes written today, especially in the South where we are, and maybe down in Central and South America as well, is the music evolves and changes. We just all get together and we pick away and we heard a song and we start to play it, and that's not classical music. It doesn't make it less, but it isn't classical because it's not written down. Classical music also, besides being written down, is the purpose is to transfer an idea or an emotion to a listener. And usually classical music makes us think. It's not always the easiest to listen to, but it does exercise the brain in a different kind of way. So just remember those couple of things about what is classical music, what makes it classical, and why is it significant, are some things you personally might want to ponder as you think through this last year. Here is a montage of composers. You could almost tell their eras by looking at their hair. Isn't it amazing that, I grew up in the 60s and hair was a big deal, and nowadays hair is a big deal. Color, stiffness, multicolored, highlights, hair is a big deal now. Well, it's old news. Look at those Baroque composers. First,
Excuse me.
Go ahead, Sam.
I can't see your screen.
You can't see my screen.
Sorry, no.
How about now?
It's loading.
Okay, I am glad you said that.
There.
You got it. Let's go back.
Thank you.
In case you need to write any of that down, that's classical music. Boy, I'm glad you said something, Sam. And there's this composer's montage. Now you can see how important hair is. All the way down through the classical and the romantic and all the way through the eras. All right, let's talk about the eras and the composers that come in those eras. Here is the medieval era. It is almost 1,000 years. Somewhere around 500 AD to about 1400 AD. Not a lot changed. It was a hard time. Sometimes called the Dark Ages. The music didn't change a lot compared to 1,000 years. Now it seems like in 1 year we have whole kinds of new music popping up. But back then it didn't change much. The chant, let's listen to some chant, some monophony, some polyphony, and it could be voices or instrumental. So here is some monophonic music. See if you can hear just one voice. Many voices, I should say, but they're all singing one melody line. Now let's go down and see if we can add more than one voice weaving together, but they're all melodies, no harmony. It does sound harmonic, but it's actually two melodies. are instruments making a similar sound. Beautiful, isn't it? Add a little percussion in there. Okay, our composer in the medieval era was Hildegard von Bingen. We see her name right here. Can you tell me anything you remember about her from the medieval era? Anyone want to type anything in or even say anything about her? Do you remember she was born in about 1000 and she was the 10th child? Do you remember that she wasn't well as an infant and her parents gave her as tithing to the church? Perhaps because they were faithful and felt like they needed to pay tithing. Perhaps they couldn't afford or didn't know how to take care of an infant who was ill. In any case, she was given as a child to the church, and they raised her, gave her a fabulous education she likely couldn't have gotten another way, and she became brilliant in natural medicine and botany and science and philosophy and religion. She learned to read and write and was a deep thinker and a composer. She was the kind of person that kings and popes called on for counsel and advice. She often called popes and kings to repentance, and she did it in such a way that it was not offensive. The only people who were offended by her were the monks that were close by because she wouldn't put up with the shenanigans that they were involved in. And she moved across the river and up a bit and built her own monastery for just nuns. She didn't want her nuns being corrupted by the wicked priests. In any case, she wrote a beautiful piece called Ordo Virtutum, which is Latin. Can you see this document? Ordo Virtutum. It's a play of virtues, and she had 16 virtues she wanted to emphasize, and so she personified them with 16 young women. Each one was a virtue, and their goal was to convert a sinner and to take him out of the clutches of Lucifer or Satan. And does that sound familiar to any of you girls who have gone through the Young Women's Program? And you may remember, let's see, if we go back to this, you may remember that this is O Dulcis Divinitas, one of the compositions of Hildegard von Bingen in the medieval time when there wasn't much truth. But there was for this woman. Singing about light and the importance of light. We could say that the gospel was taken from the earth and the priesthood authority was taken from the earth, but individuals who were close to heaven still received personal revelation. And Hildegard von Bingen was one of those who would have made a great young women's president in our day. Beautiful. That's the medieval era. The Renaissance era, we didn't talk about this year. We'll talk about that another year, but you should know that during the Renaissance era, Gutenberg invented the printing press, and music would never be the same. Yeah, I have here that it could be mass-produced. That's it could be really mass-produced. You know, a dozen or two copies, or maybe 100 or two copies, and to share them on foot over mountain and hill and dale, and that wasn't really very easy easy like compared to what it is now, but it was certainly easier to use a printing press than to print everything off by hand. So we'll talk about the Renaissance era next year, and it's also awesome. Let's move into the Baroque era. Everything is extremely ornate. Music was written at the bequest of the church, of the government, or of the rich people. Composers didn't compose what they were dreaming about. They were like news reporters on assignment, and they would compose according to the church, the government, and the rich people. It certainly would stifle some creativity. But those great Baroque composers made the best of it. The one we studied this year was Domenico Scarlatti. You remember that he is one of, I want you to remember this too, so I'm going to write it up here on our blackboard. We have the class of 1685. We have three great Baroque composers who were born in the class of 1685, and that is Bach, Handel, and Scarlatti. All three of those born the same year. Bach and Handel born in Germany. Handel pretty much left Germany and became an English citizen, finished his work, composed the Messiah, and all the things he did in English. Scarlatti was born in Italy and spent all of his time on the coasts of the Mediterranean, either in Spain or Portugal or Italy. His wives, he had two wives, and after the first one died, he married another one, and one was Spanish and one was Portuguese. And so those three men, just remember, they were all born in the same year, and they all have similarities in their music. Scarlatti did seem to have some of that Mediterranean pizzazz and sparkle and fire to his music. That you look at Scarlatti's name, you got to see reds and yellows, and being just a little bit different, more guitar, more mandolin than perhaps Bach and Handel. So that's our Baroque. I should tell you this. Because they could now write music down, as opposed to before when, for example, Hildegard von Bingen would just hear this melody in her head, and she would teach it to them by singing it to them, and then they would sing it and sing it to each other, and they would have to learn it by ear, and they weren't really sure what it looked like on paper because it was all by ear. Well, because we could now write stuff down in the Baroque era, tonality came into being. Tonality meaning that now we had major and minor keys, and it was this distance to this distance from one note to the next. La da, or a half step, la da 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 da. All of those tones were exact now. There were 8 notes in a scale, 7 notes plus a repeat. There were 12 notes to 12 half steps in an octave. And you can see here major and minor scales were all written out, and that was the rule. Before that, it could be all over the place. In our day, it's kind of all over the place. But back in the Baroque era, they started these keys of major and minor. And when you start a piece in C major, you stay in C major until you make a transition into F or G or one of the other keys. But it's all done with rules, and it's all done written down. That started with Bach. Kept very close in classical music and romantic music. The tonality changed a little, but not the basic rules in impressionistic. Modern era was a lot the same, with a few differences. We get into contemporary music, and they've thrown tonality out the window, and now they don't have the rules of tonality anymore in many genres today. But it started in the Baroque era. Remember that. Tonality, Baroque. Scales, Baroque. Now the Classical era. The Classical era is when the piano evolved in the Classical era. It was started and perfected by the end of the Classical and into the Romantic era for a couple of reasons. One is Mozart was born, and he belonged on a piano. The other reason is Beethoven was composing during the Classical era, and a harpsichord, the keyboard was too short. It didn't have all the notes needed for Beethoven's hearing. Remember, he became completely deaf by the time he was 30. And as he was losing his hearing, he could only hear certain lower notes. And those low notes were not on a harpsichord. They were on a piano. So in my opinion, the piano became perfected in Beethoven's day so that he could hear those low notes longer. Without that, it wouldn't have happened. So let's talk about, let's see, let me look at this. Oh yes, during the classical era, composers were still composing as craftsmen as opposed to creators. By the end of the classical era, Beethoven had given up composing what he was told. And he absolutely joined the Romantic era a little bit early. We say he has a foot in each era, classical and Romantic, because he was very, very successful. He no longer needed to do what he was told, and he composed from his heart. And if his autobiography were written, it would be in music. You can hear the sadness and the despair and the happiness and the beauty all in Beethoven's music without words. During the classical era, not only were composers fighting against the traditions of their culture, but America was fighting for freedom. We won the War of Independence. European countries were struggling for more freedom and opportunities. Scientists had created the smallpox vaccine, and they discovered hydrogen and oxygen atoms. They steam engine and electric motors. Musical became more reasonable, not so many frills as in the Baroque era, and that was kind of nice. Remember, Mozart was a child prodigy. Now, a child prodigy is a child that seems to have been born with brilliance in one area or another, and Mozart was that way. From a tiny child, he was brilliant. And one example is they went to the Vatican. His father was awesome. He took him to the music centers of Europe, he and his sister, as children. Mozart met great composers and great musicians and entertained them to the wazoo. It was fabulous. One time they went down to Italy, to the Vatican, and sat through a concert, an orchestral concert. It was a small orchestra, and classical orchestras were not very big, but it was a small orchestra. And he listened to them play a secret song. It was owned by the Vatican, and it was not allowed to be written down and taken outside the Vatican. It was one that was supposed to be sacred, only to be played and heard and understood inside the Vatican walls, which is the smallest city in the world, just right inside Rome. Smallest country in the world, actually. Well, Mozart was 10 years old. I believe he was 10 years old. And he went home that night after listening to that concert, and the next day he wrote down the whole thing, note for every instrument, every voice. He's definitely a child prodigy. And it was correct. The Vatican was so pleased that they allowed him to share it with others. They knew they couldn't keep it as long as they let Mozart hear a song. It was no longer a secret that he could go ahead and recreate it, play it himself. That was pretty cool. Anybody know anything else about Mozart they'd like to share? You played music by Mozart. It's crazy fun. He loved entertaining. Then we'll move on to the Romantic era. The Romantic era began with at the end of a classical era where there were lots of advances made in the standard of living. People no longer had to worry so much about survival, and they could actually think about things like, oh, didn't Mozart? Yes. Oh, I don't know if he wrote it when he was 8. He sure could have. He did amazing, amazing things very, very young, and he did write the Magic Flute. Good point, Sabrina. In the Romantic era, because they were no longer like journalists on assignment, and because life was not as hard as it had been in previous centuries and eras, they could think about things like family and children and how important the common man was and how wonderful it was to be just a common man and how children didn't die quite so quickly, and so they were able to express in music and poetry, the beauties of family and little ones. So they could write from their heart. And I told you before that Beethoven is one who was kind of a leader. The two composers we talked about were Franz Liszt and Camille Saint-Saëns. Now, does anyone remember anything about Franz Liszt or Saint-Saëns? You remember the countries they were born in? Or any of the pieces that they wrote? See, those are great. France, you are right. They were both born in France. You are right. Here's Franz Liszt. Let's listen to just a little bit of Lisztomania and see if you can't hear the romance in this piece. And I'm so glad that someone wrote this piece. I just don't know what we'd do without. Lisztomania is the name of this piece by Franz Liszt. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about Liszt, but I want you to remember, he was born with opportunities that many composers did not have. Many of our composers had a hard life, a hard childhood. They grew up in poverty or illness. Franz Liszt was not one of those. His parents were well enough to do that they could give him musical opportunities as a child and acquaintance with Handel and Beethoven both. Franz Liszt became kind of a, what should I say? Well, we talked about, let me write this term on our blackboard. There we go, Lisztomania. Do you remember what Lisztomania is? He was freaky popular as an entertainer. The women would throw their hands up and throw things onto the stage and just try to get close to him because they were just crazy wild over him. He was such a silly, goofy entertainer. He made, let me see, I gotta find this. Can you hear those great big hands? Let's see. Yes, he was a real ladies' man, that's true. He made so much money by the time he was in the middle of his life, in his 40s, that he decided enough already. I've made enough money. From now on, all of my money goes to charity. All the money I make off of piano concerts goes to charity. And so he built schools and he repaired hospitals and he repaired the monument to Beethoven that was falling apart. And schools, he either built schools or repaired schools or provided materials for schools, and was awesome about giving away the things he no longer need. I mean, he just didn't need. Instead of just making himself more and more wealthy, he helped others. Now, he helped others in other ways as well. For example, if a struggling composer couldn't get his music published or played, Liszt would play it. He would play the music and give the new composer credit, or he would pay to have the new composer's music published so that it would become popular and to help give the new composer a boost. He also took orchestral pieces and turned them into piano pieces and played them to make them familiar and popular. And I don't know if you know how important that is. In our day, Uh, for example, the reason the Beatles became famous is because every radio station played their music. It's not necessarily their music was the most popular because it was unfamiliar. But as soon as people heard it 10,000 times, it became the most popular. And Liszt did that for his contemporary composers. So if you want to remember something marvelous about Liszt, you can remember that he was very generous. We talked about, because I have been given much, I too must give. Liszt was a good example of doing just that. Now, our next composer is Saint-Saëns. Let's listen to the Swan. You'll also hear the romantic element to this song. Called the Swan. Now, Camille Saint-Saëns was also a child prodigy. He composed a little song when he was 3 years and 5 months old. And that song is in the National Museum in Paris, France. He is exactly the one who wrote the Carnival of Animals. Annika, you are exactly right. Let me tell you about, he had his very first public recital was when he was 10 years old, and he played a very complex concerto by Beethoven. And then he offered to play, or Mozart, I believe. Ooh, I could be wrong. Might have been. Anyway, he promised to play any of the piano sonatas by Beethoven. There are 30 or 40 of them. Any one of them, anyone asked. He was so famous at age 10 as being a pianist that it went all the way around the world, the information. Now, back to Carnival of Animals, Annika. He was 51 when he wrote that song. It's a collection of smaller pieces for a group of about, 14, 15 instrumentalists. And they're darling. They became his most famous work. But, well, I am going to have to show you something. Just a second. You just enjoy that piece there for a minute. Okay, here we go. He was considered the world's greatest organist. He was considered to have the greatest musical mind of his era. He composed music that was so technically difficult that it required the skills of a virtuoso. He was the first one to compose music for motion picture. He was an expert in mathematics. He wrote a philosophical book. He wrote poetry and plays. He designed his own telescope. He used his knowledge of astronomy to schedule his concerts during solar eclipses. Now, when he's 51 years old, Annika, you got it. What you've written there is exactly right. When he was 51 years old, he wrote this Carnival of Animals that you see on the screen right now. And they were so cute. He was on vacation when he wrote it, and he was so worried that people would think he was weird, you're right, or not a serious composer, that he was kind of foolish, that he refused to let them publish any of his work except the one we just listened to, The Swan. They finally talked him into letting people play The Swan while he was still alive. The rest of them, he didn't want him out there till he was dead. And so that's what happened. And our idea behind Camille Saint-Saëns is he had 50 years of people clapping for him. He had people around the world thinking what you are thinking, Sabrina, that this guy is a genius. And he is a genius. But he wasn't confident about producing a work that he had created when he was 51 years old, which says something about the source of confidence, which is not applause, is it? It's not applause. It's not worldly applause. The scriptures and the Doctrine and Covenants show us that confidence comes from virtuous thoughts and from choosing the right. And we can certainly learn that from Camille Saint-Saëns, that the things he did in his life did not produce a lot of confidence for him. So there's our two romantic composers. Now we have impressionistic composer. We see Claude Debussy as ours. Now you see the impressionistic era is very short. It's only about 20 years. Impressionistic composers that we accuse of being impressionistic didn't like to be called impressionistic. They just, I suppose they wanted to just be left romantic or with no label at all. But their music was as different from former music as this painting is from former paintings. It gives the idea. If you look here, you can see silhouettes of people in the background or homes or farms or something, and your imagination can run wild looking at this image as you just become really more and more peaceful. The impressionistic composers were less about fancy, ostentatious entertainment as they were about peace and imagination and being calm. It was more about the whole idea of this painting more than about showing off one of the instruments. Let's go down and listen to, actually the one I want you to listen to is this one, Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. See if you recognize this. Can you feel like being in a woods and just looking and seeing what nature reveals itself? What little animal or little insect or little animal comes and its little eyes perk up and its ears move from one way to the other? Not really sure what you see, but you see it and you feel it. That's impressionistic. Claude Debussy didn't have a super happy life. He had a beautiful little daughter that he loved. And there are some who think that that may be the only person Debussy ever really loved or was ever loved by. They died just not very long apart. She was just 14 years old, I believe. Gorgeous. Now, if you're not all into listening to this music a lot, imagine how well you could learn your studies or go to sleep or calm your home down if you listen to some of Claude Debussy's music. Just putting it on in the background. You can see over here that you can get a whole mix of Claude Debussy's music in some of these playlists, or use our own family school playlist. So that's impressionistic music. You can see that's right at the turn of the century, right when automobiles were being invented and life was good in the United States during those years for the most part. Now, I need you to understand a little bit of the change that I am making in understanding these eras. We've used that term for a long time, since I was a kid. And now, it's been 50 years since I was a kid, and I don't know how to call that contemporary anymore. So I have looked, I have researched, I have read books and articles and magazine articles, and more people than just me are being a little uncomfortable by calling the stuff back in the 50s and 60s contemporary when we're in 2015. So when you look at the old family school books, you'll see contemporary era covers most of the 1900s, and that's not true. So contemporary is going to be 1975 to now. And if we go back to 1900 to 1975, we're going to call that the modern era. And so when we go to our slideshow here, we're going to talk about, I guess, 1890 to 1975, the modern era. And let me find the paper I'm looking at now. Where did it go? So in the modern era, we're not going to talk too much about some of this stuff that's being composed right now. Let's see. Good. We're still doing good on time. In the modern era, they were deciding, had new ideas on what was beautiful, what music was beautiful, and music, of course, could be written now, and instruments were being developed and changed. And so they were thinking of new ways to create melodies, new ways to create harmonies, and some went off into the rock, soft rock, some went off into country music, some went off into jazz or blues or bluegrass. Stravinsky is the composer we talked about, and his music was still orchestral, but it was different. So when someone heard his first great orchestral piece, what did they want to do to it? Do you remember? What did they want Igor Stravinsky to do with his Fireworks orchestral piece? You know what? That's a good idea, Sabrina. They wanted him to turn it into a ballet. And maybe that was modernizing it. Maybe those fabulous ballets were just coming on the scene and they were looking for music. And when they heard Igor Stravinsky's music, his music just told a story. So you can see this little fellow here, that's the Fireworks. Now let's pull this down. Let's go back to our blackboard. Fireworks was the name of his great work. When they changed it, it became the Firebird Suite. And it was the story of the Firebird. And you remember the story of the Firebird that the Russian fellow caught and captured, and the Firebird, through dance, not through any words or lyrics, said, if you will let me go, I will one day help you. When you're in a tough spot, I will help you. And gave the fellow, Ivan, a little red feather, and the Firebird went off. And you remember the woods was cursed by some evil creature, and it was sort of like Sleeping Beauty's forest, where a lot of the creatures were kind of turned into statues or made lifeless. And of course, Ivan falls in love, and there's a conflict, and right at the last moment where things don't look so good, the Firebird comes and whispers in his ear, this is how you can conquer evil. You find this egg and break it. As when you break the egg, you'll kill the evil person, the evil influence, and life will be good. And that's what happened. And this is this gorgeous ballet with this beautiful Firebird. Now, he wrote another piece, and they turned it into a ballet, and it was called Petrushka. Do you remember the characters in the ballet Petrushka? You remember it's the one with, let me move this down. We'll just move all this down. In that ballet, there were 3 puppets. The three puppets were the love triangle. There was a Moor and a beautiful ballerina and Petrushka, who was really a puppet. They were all puppets, but Petrushka was playing a puppet. The other two were people. And both the Moor and Petrushka loved this sweet little ballerina, and she actually leans towards the Moor, and that breaks Petrushka's heart. And so the whole ballet is the story of this love triangle and who gets the girl. Well, that's different. And we're going to put that in the modern era now. It wasn't unusual in that it used an orchestra, but it was unusual that it didn't seem right to have just an orchestral piece. It needed to do something different that made it modern, as Sabrina says, and it made it into a ballet. So one of the characteristics of a modern era is that there's not one kind of music. There's a division, and all these genres of music are equally wonderful. And that's one definition. Oh, Vivian. Great. Thank you, Sabrina. I'm glad to have that distinction that you are Vivian and not Sabrina. So there's the modern. Any questions on the modern era? Do you understand how it is no longer called contemporary? And contemporary goes from 1975 to now. It has some of the characteristics of the modern era because they all kind of fade together, and then some great distinctions that we'll talk about another time. Which came first? Modern era came first. Contemporary will keep moving. When you get to be my age, you will still be living in the contemporary era. And what we're living in now will have to have a different name. I don't know what the name will be. But contemporary had better keep moving as time moves on, don't you think? That's sort of the definition of contemporary is current. It's right now. Thank you. I'm glad you. Any other questions on modern or contemporary? And actually, you can look up modern era now or postmodern era now, and they actually have Google sites, and there are magazine articles that now acknowledge we can no longer call, from 1900 to now and forevermore contemporary. We just can't do it. So we've made that, little change that comes with time. Other great musicians that we didn't talk about in eras. Most of them are probably in the modern era, but no, that's not true. Not these next two. How about this? Do you remember about Antonio Stradivari and Guido of Arezzo? Do I have his name spelled right? I think that's supposed to be an E. That Guido of Arezzo is not right. Arezzo, I believe. What do you know about these two fellas? Can you tell me what era they lived in by looking at their dates? What do you think? What era covered 1644 to 1737 or thereabouts? Baroque, there you go. And what did Antonio Stradivari, what was his contribution to music? He made not just violins, he made all string instruments. We even have some Stradivari guitars, still one or two, maybe three guitars that he made, still all put together, and we know where they are today. He made violas, he made string basses, he made, and there are 600 of those instruments are still here today. He had the best teacher. He was apprenticed out to the best teacher. The best craftsman for violins. His teacher, we also have violins that are still around today and still beautiful and in good working order that were created by his master craftsman, luthier, L-U-T-H. I better write that down so that you can see. A luthier. That's how you spell a maker or a repairer of stringed instrument is called a luthier. I just took my 200-year-old violin to a luthier. I've had him looked at by other luthiers, and I never felt like they were qualified to even touch my old fiddle that came from Kentucky to Utah back with pioneers and was played by my many greats grandfather, and my own personal grandfather played it too, and it had come down 3 generations to get to him. And so I found one I could trust, an old fellow in Louisville, and he looked at that instrument and he could see on the sides of the violin where the top plate and the bottom plate were put on the ribs around the side, and there was some wearing on, yes, 200 years old. There was some wearing in some certain places on that top and bottom plate. And he picked up that violin and he said, this violin was created on the East Coast or Europe or I don't know where, but it made the trip to the West, didn't it? And I said, yes, it did. And he said, I can tell you whether it went by sea or by covered wagon. Now, he didn't know I was a Mormon. He is not a Mormon. Had no idea that the Mormon pioneers had put their stuff in wagons and handcarts and jostled them all the way across the plains. He said this violin went across the plains in a covered wagon or in a wagon, because this wearing on the top and the bottom plate on both sides of your fiddle, inside its case, came because it made that 2,000-mile trek across the plains. Now, when he said that, I thought, well, this is the man I need to spiff up my fiddle and make it perfect. And so for $500, it was cheap to have him make it perfect. And he did. It was awesome. That's what a luthier does. Today, there are luthiers. There's a fabulous luthier in Salt Lake City right now and other places. But pick and choose if you need a luthier. Antonio Stradivari, they have done tons of tests on his instruments. They've tested the wood he used, and they tested the varnish and the preservatives. The wood is put in lagoons, in water, and chemicals in water, and the chemicals soak into the wood, and that's why the wood doesn't deteriorate like everything else you have that's made of wood after, back in the 1600s, 400 years, 400, 500 years, these instruments are still as good as new because the preservatives have soaked into the wood. So they've tested those preservatives, and then there's a varnish on the outside that adds to the sound as well as the rainbow colors in the way the instrument shines. So they've done all the tests on these to find out the secrets of Stradivari. Did he have secret wood? Did he have a secret formula for preservatives? Did he have a secret formula for varnish? Secret ingredients? What was secret about it? And you know what they've determined? I'm going to write this down on our whiteboard. And you write it down too. He had no secrets. He used nothing unusual, no ingredients that were unusual or that are not available today and that were not available to the other luthiers of his day. There was just something about the man that he could put together a fiddle that sounded better and that still sounds better. And there are other beautiful luthiers today that make violins that probably rival a Stradivari, but the greatest musicians, string musicians in the world would love to own or be able to play a Stradivari. Now, the secret to Stradivari's success is him, just him. Now, what do you remember? Didn't we figure out that he lived just at the right time? Yes, you did. Yes, when it comes to wood, that he had lived, that he had the talent. Yes, he did live at a time where there had been a mini ice age, and the trees had slowed their growth, and so the wood was dense. Now, but everyone lived at that time. He's not the only one who lived there after this little mini ice age, and those trees are still there. And there have been many ice ages since then. And so the wood is still, there was nothing that he had that other people didn't have and that they don't have today. I'd love to play a Stradivari guitar. I would love to as well. I'm not good enough to deserve to be able to play a Stradivari guitar, but maybe in the next life I would love to do that, and I hope that you're able to as well. What do we know of Guido of Arezzo? That I have not spelled right. What do you think? I wish I could change it now. I'm embarrassed. So please don't. I'm going to go to our other one so I can spell it right for you. That's his name. What do we know about Guido of Arezzo? Does anyone remember? Well, I'll tell you. He was a monk who loved choir music. And he liked to teach the monks how to sing. But it took so long. He would have to, yes, it is something about a song. He would have to sing to them what he wanted them to sing, and then they would have to listen a little close. And if they weren't paying attention or they didn't happen to be there that day, he had to start all over and sing and then sing. And so he decided there's got to be a better way. And the monks that he would, yes, he's the one who came up with solfege, the do, re, mi. Annika, you are right. And music notes, you are right. Vivian, you are right. He wrote it down. He's the one who wrote 4 lines, and he put notes on those 4 lines. Now, we have a 5-line staff now, but we got to understand that that all evolved. The idea of writing lines and putting notes on a line was revolutionary as any other language. To write the language down, Guido is the one who started that with music. And he said, if I do this, I can teach a choir how to sing as much music in a few months as you can in 10 years. Well, the monks around him wanted nothing to do with it, and so he got reassigned to another place, and there was no monastery there, so he really had nothing to do. But there did happen to be 2 fabulous choirs in the town. And so he just kind of buddied up with them and said, I'd like to help. And in his helping, he taught them to read those notes, and he could taught those choirs in just 4 or 5 months what took him 10 years to teach the other monks by ear. But he also, if you remember, and I wish you could see my hand, do you remember the Guido hand? Where he could point to this part of his thumb and this part of his middle finger and this part of his palm of his hand, and he trained them that when he pointed to this parts of his hand, they would sing a certain note. And so he could write it all down, but you can see this was before the printing press. Or he could stand in front of his choirs, tell them what the note or what they were supposed to say, and then he would point to his hand to tell them what note to sing. And that was Guido of Arezzo. So we could give him credit for really the creation of classical music in some ways, because they could finally write it down and it didn't change. And you could take the music home, you could take your hand home, you could memorize it right away, you could come back, you didn't have to start over in a choir. You could just start where you left off, learn a new song, finish perfecting a song. I get to teach I lead the choir in our ward, and I always so thrilled. We'll work hard on one little 6 or 7 measures, and then the next week we'll work on something else and come back to that 6 or 7 measures, and by Joe, they will have remembered it from last week. They can look at that music and something comes back and they can sing it. And a few years ago when we started out, no chance. I should hope you could take your hand home. Yes. yes. So I love Guido of Arezzo. I'd love to meet him someday. He's kind of an unsung hero. Most people have never even heard of him. Even great musicians maybe haven't even heard of him and have never thought to say thank you in their prayers. Find Guido, Heavenly Father, and thank that guy, because he did a great thing for music in every generation. So we've talked about all of our eras. We've talked about all of our composers, and now we've talked about 2 ancient musicians that did a great thing for music, and now we have a few more lessons to review where they're just kind of miscellaneous. And here's 3 of them. What do you see here? What do these pictures in this slide remind you of? You remember what these lessons were about? Yeah, meet me in St. Louis. That is right. That's one of them. That's the one on the bottom. Now, in the scene you're watching, that you're seeing this picture of, Grandpa is dancing Oh, the question. The question is, what lessons do these three pictures remind you of that we talked about this year? And Vivian said, Meet Me in St. Louis, and the one that's in color with the red, a Christmas scene, is Meet Me in St. Louis. Now, if you remember, Esther is dancing with grandfather, and he's going around the back of that Christmas tree. You remember the song that was being played by the orchestra as they're dancing. Grandfather and Esther are dancing in this scene. Do you remember the name of the music? Because that is key. Now you all can see this blackboard, right? This whiteboard that I'm typing on. You can all see the screen? True? Okay, good. Home Sweet Home. Do you remember that song being played in the movie? Do you remember that there was no lyrics? No one sang Home Sweet Home. If you didn't already know that song, you would have missed it entirely. It just comes while they dance, and then the music fades into something else. Just as grandfather and Esther go around behind the tree, she comes out not with grandfather, she's dancing with her sweetheart. But do you remember why that why would they play Home Sweet Home just at that moment in the movie? Hey, that's good. Two of them at least are definitely Christmas. The other one, it looks like in a winter time. I don't know about Christmas for the one, but let's go back to Meet Me. You need to understand the theme of Meet Me in St. Louis was Home Sweet Home. It's all about the bumps and fits and starts of family life, of how everybody knocks against each other and we grow up and there's hard times and we make mistakes, and the older generation helps the younger generation repent and get back on track, and it all happens at home. And so when Esther has made a terrible blunder and they're all unhappy, yes, everything is resolved and finally is going to be wonderful. Yes, because Esther realizes she's made a terrible blunder and Grandpa helps her get past it. He doesn't take away the consequence, but he in fact, she's suffered before Grandpa cuts in and dances with her. She's really suffered at the dance. But he tells her he's proud of her because she has grown up. And the Home Sweet Home is playing while that little part happens. And so remember, when you watch this movie with your family, remember to listen for the instrumental Home Sweet Home, which at the time this movie was produced was very famous. It was a Civil War song. Everybody knew it. Every musician that was any kind of a musician had a rendition of Home Sweet Home as a recording. It's sort of like Silent Night, or some of those other songs that everybody has sung it on one of their. We watched it last night. Did you hear the song, Vivian? Did you hear Home Sweet Home? Or do you need to go back and find this scene and listen closer? Good, good. Remember, that's the theme of that movie. Now, let's go back up to Handel's Messiah. This year we talked about the three sheep songs. All We Like Sheep Have Gone Astray with the popcorn, where the music changes from fast and bouncy to very solemn in the end, where we say, because we have gone astray and done all these fun things we thought were fun, the Savior has paid the price. And when we get to that last part, the music gets solemn and slower and softer. Yes, yes, we're almost done. We're almost done so that you can all get to your geography class. Street musicians, we talked about that last time. I don't think that will be hard for you to remember all of the great things about street musicians. Don't forget about moral law. You might want to think through. Moral law is not something that's legislated. It's not something you break and go to jail. A moral law is something we all understand is right and wrong. Even those who are fighting for wrong legislation and for wrong things that happen in this world, they say that wrong is right and right is wrong. In their heart of hearts, they know what they're doing is not correct, because moral law is God's law and it doesn't change. Don't forget that. Music is a moral law. We see these two examples of family. They can't be argued. You are right. You are right. If someone tries to argue it, you just smile at them. You don't need to argue it because their heart will tell them that they are not right. Families that have music in their homes are happy. That's music is a moral law, and that is evidence of that. Reason and relate. If you go to the module, I would love it if you would just notice how many times the angel Moroni gave Joseph Smith instructions on where to find the Book of Mormon. Why did he repeat himself? This is my favorite one. If you get a chance to look at this, how many times does Moroni repeat the phrase, tight like unto a dish? Why does he do that? And what does it mean? How does it relate to you? We won't have time to go that because you've got to go to your next one. Now, there's no homework except to listen to the music, review and remember these people, listen to the music in your life forever. Take the final exam. Take it today or tomorrow. Soon. Take it real soon because we've done a review on everything now. I think you could go through them. It'll take you a little longer to do the essays, but not long at all to do the multiple choice. Listen to the music one more time. I want to tell you how much I have loved being your teacher this year. I have loved these classes. I haven't loved every one because I've had to learn so much about technology, but I have learned to love you and all of even the students that aren't here today. And I hope you do great in your life. And we'll see you. I'll be watching for your finals. How's that? Talk to you later. Bye, guys. Thank you, Annika.